Last week, we got into a new sermon series focused on great children's stories of the Bible. And it wasn't that our goal was to abridge the stories or to soften down the language of the stories to fit younger children, but rather to look at stories where God used young people to do great things. And in doing so, to challenge our youth today that God can use you and that He wants to use you to do great things. Today I'd like to continue in that direction as we look at one of the most well-known youth stories of the Bible, and it has to be of David and Goliath. When I was a young boy, we did not go to church. I wasn't a believer, but my mom was involved in watching the Jimmy Baker PTL hour that was going on. Some of you remember all of that. And all I remember out of there was that when she had given some money to the organization, they had sent for a certain level of commitment, they had sent this plaque, this little statue-like thing that was of the young boy David getting ready to swing this massive sword to cut off the head of Goliath. Now, like I said, I didn't go to church at that time. I wasn't a believer, but I remember seeing that statue in our house, and I remember getting into the story because it was about the youngest of the brothers who became victorious. And that resonated with me because I'm the youngest of three boys, and it just resonated that someday I'd be victorious over my own brothers. I'm still waiting for the day to happen. I'm not sure it's going to come, but there's hope, and I keep praying. The point of it is this, that we all resonate with the idea of the underdog becoming the victor. And I want you to know today that I think that this story helps us to understand how God can use even the smallest of individuals to achieve the mightiest of results. And our young people today, I think, sometimes feel like they're the small, insignificant people of the church. But I want to encourage you today to know this, that God can use you to bring about mighty things in the church. What I'd like to do this morning is just walk through the Bible story of 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you have your Bible, you can turn there. I don't have time to read through all the story and also share what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk through the story. I'm going to just kind of tell you the story, and you can go back and reread the story later on this afternoon. So let me just kind of walk you through. There's 6 lessons I want to give you. Some apply to our youth today. Some apply to our adults. Some apply to both of us. Let me just kind of open up the story here a little bit about what's going on. Israel finds themselves engaged in battle with their longtime enemy, the Philistines. The Philistines has been a warrior nation. They are a warrior society. They have settled themselves in the shoreline area of Palestine. And now they have amassed at Sukkoth for a showdown. And the armies have lined up in the battlefield. We have the army of Israel on one side, and we have the army of the Philistines on the other side. And as the army of Israel peers out across the battlefield, their heart sinks as they see soldier after soldier after soldier, but then they see this massive man. His name is Goliath in the scriptures. And the Bible tells us that Goliath is over 9 feet tall. He is from the town of Gath, one of the 5 major Philistine cities. He is gleaming with armor from top to bottom, from a bronze helmet to a coat of bronze armor that weighed over 125 pounds. The shaft of the spear, it says, like the size of a weaver's rod. It's not some small rod. This is a thick piece of wood. The iron tip at the end of this spear alone weighed 15 pounds. This guy has killed many men on the battlefield. He is a hardened warrior. He is what we would call the equivalent of today. He is like the M1 Abrams tank of the Old Testament. This guy is a killing machine. And he stands there taunting the armies of Israel. And he tells them something that was sort of common in this time, and that was to have one champion from each side come out and fight. And the champion of that battle then would determine whether one whole side wins or not. Instead of everyone dying, we just have these 2 guys fighting with one another. And so here Goliath is saying, send out your best soldier, let us fight. And if he kills me, well, then we will be subject to you. But if I kill him, then you will be subject to us. When he calls this out, great fear strikes over the army of Israel. Because no one wants to go out and fight this guy that's literally twice their size. In the midst of this whole scene comes this young boy, David. Just one chapter earlier, we've read that David was anointed as the future king, as God was removing his mantle from King Saul and placing it upon this young boy, David. But David hasn't been ushered into the throne room yet. Nothing has happened as far as him ruling the nation. In fact, David had gone back to shepherding his father's sheep. His dad, Jesse, says, hey, take some of this food, go to the front lines, take it to your brothers, see what's going on with the battle there, come back and bring me some news. And while David goes to the front line, he happens to hear what is going on. He hears Goliath taunting, and David begins to hear the men talk amongst themselves about what King Saul will do to the person who conquers this mammoth of a man. And in verse 24, let me just read this portion of the text to you in chapter 17. When the Israelites saw the man, they ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes. And David asked the men standing nearby, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? And they continue to talk about what King Saul promised that he would do. Now, here's the first lesson I want you to write down, and it's specifically geared towards the youth that are here today. Lesson number 1, be informed about the world in which you live. Be informed about the world in which you live. David was tending his father's sheep, but he was also paying close attention to the activities that were happening within his country. They were at war. And while he was on the front line, he was listening and he was watching everything that was going on around them. He realized that what happened in that battle scene there was going to affect his life. If the nation of Israel won, then they would be triumphing over the nation of the Philistines. But if Goliath was to win, he knew they would become subject, they would be slaves then to this pagan people. So how does that translate to us today? We need to be aware of the greater surroundings in which we live. One thing that is easy for all of us, but I think especially when we're young, is to be inward focused. We fail to realize that we are a part of a greater society. We get caught up and we get focused on just our generation, just our small group, just our peers that are around us. Learning to understand how you fit and how you affect the larger group is a sign of great spiritual maturity. This is extremely important in the church setting, especially as you transition from our youth activities into student ministry activities into the early college age stuff. We got stuff going on at the Chapel's house this afternoon to try to help with some of those different things, and transitioning on into young adulthood and into the rest of the adult ministries that are happening church-wide. One of the problems that I see in churches is there's a huge gap transition when you get 18 and now you're pushed out, you graduate out of high school, but you haven't really transitioned to the rest of what the whole church is doing, and you fall away from the church because you feel like you don't fit in. It is important to realize, to be informed about what your whole church is doing, all the ministries that are going on, and the ones that you will grow into, the ones that you can be a part of, where you can serve and lead in them. Be aware about what's going on in the greater world around you. As the story moves on in verses 28 and following, when David does get to the front line, you think he'd be greeted with open arms by his brother. Oh, thank you, Brother David, for coming and bringing the food to us. But that's not what happens. His older brother, Eliab, David's older brother, hears of him and he burns with anger, the scripture says, and he begins to chastise David. He says these words, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is and how you came down only to watch the battle." Now David responds, "Now what have I done?" Have you ever had that feeling? Now what have I done? And that's David. Now what have I done? Can't I even speak to defend myself? He doesn't even get a word in edgewise, and his brother's just hammering on him about how he's done so many terrible things. So here's the second lesson I want to share with us today. This is geared towards the adults. Don't assume the worst with young people. Don't automatically assume the worst with young people. David's older brother automatically assumes the worst with his younger brother. He hasn't come for any good reason. He's only come to check out the sights, to take in the sounds of the battle. He was a little bored out there with the sheep, and so he's come here. And now he's a distraction to everyone else. Furthermore, he's a terrible, lazy shepherd because he left the sheep. Who's caring for them? While he's here, they're defenseless. None of that was true. David had put someone in charge of the sheep when he came there, but he doesn't get a chance to say that because his older brother is constantly blasting him, won't allow him to explain himself. It is so easy for us as adults sometimes to think the worst about young people with their new ideas and their new ways. We too easily get defensive in our thinking. They want to change everything that I hold dear. They're going to push us out. They have no morals. They have no standards. Well, it's just all going down the tubes now. You can hear those kind of statements. You might even have said those kind of statements. Now, let me just say that sometimes I agree that some young people have that attitude. That attitude that it's all about them. They want to change everything no matter if it's working or not. They want to push it out. They want to have what they want. I get that. But not everybody is that way. And we as adults have to take responsibility for the attitudes that we see in every generation that is after us. When you think about it and you go back and look at history, the decade of the 60s were not so great. And they rolled over into the 70s, and we got disco, and we've never gotten rid of it, and that wasn't so great. And that rolled into the 80s, and no one could fix the Rubik's Cube. And then we rolled into the 90s, and we got all that headbanging music from Seattle and coffee shops that'll never go away. When coffee costs more than gasoline, folks, there's a problem. And then we roll into the 2000s, and we got, every generation is building on there. And you think about the problems we have now, and we talk about with our X generation, my generation, or the millennial generation. Where do you think that started? I had baby boomers, and those baby boomer generation wasn't the greatest generation. And even the greatest generation wasn't the greatest generation. They all had their own problems. We need to take responsibility for what we have been leading and teaching our children. Amen? Yeah, some of you are like, amen. You don't want to accept it, but we have to. I'm taking responsibility for at least one of my children. Michelle takes responsibility for the other. We're not telling you which one we're taking responsibility for, all right? Don't automatically assume the worst of young people. Don't always think that way. When I look out across our youth, I am excited about it because I see people who stretch my ideas, who stretch my comfort zones. I hear songs that I don't normally like to listen to, and I'm not really quite sure about, but I see that they love it and it speaks to God. We have a young woman today, we're going to talk about Brittany, who is getting ready to walk out of what she knows and how she's grown up, to go into a country that she does, a continent she's never been before, for 2 months to go into Africa to serve and just tell people about Jesus and that she loves them. When I look out across our youth, there are young men and women who carry our worship teams and help when we're lacking with musicians. We have a young man whose goal is to go full-time into missionary service. We have young people who are volunteering in our toddlers programs and our summer of service project and a lot of what happens with VBS. We have teens who love one another and love God and love God's word. We have young people who are not perfect but who desire for their schools and their communities to be a better and more godly place. When I look at our youth, I'm excited and I think that we ought to give them a hand for what God is doing in their lives. We need to encourage them all the more as we see them growing up in the Lord and not judge them too quickly because they're not like us. Thank God they're not like us. And we pray that they are better than us. The story moves on in verses 31 through 37. Seeing the situation, David comes up to King Saul and he says, hey, don't worry about this. I'm going to go fight for Israel. And Saul thinks this is absolute suicide. Saul even tells him, hey, you're just a boy, and he's been a warrior from birth. This is a mixed match. This is not going to work. But David knows something that Saul doesn't know. David knows that God has been with him several times before when he struck down the bear and the lion when he was defending his father's flock. When the animal would come out to try to snatch away one of the lambs, David would sling the stone and strike and kill that animal, or he would drive him away with the staff. David knew that he should have been eaten, but because God was with him, he was the victor. And if he was the victor then, he will be with him now. So here's the third lesson geared towards our youth. Learn the difference between confidence and arrogance. Learn the difference between confidence and arrogance. David had seen God's mighty hand protect him, and he knew now that he would triumph even in this challenge that was before him. Knowing your abilities is confidence, but telling everybody how great you are and all about your abilities is arrogance. One is accepted by people, and the other one is discouraged and looked down upon. I don't know why this is, but it happens to me a lot. I meet people who come and talk to me from time to time, and they begin to tell me all about their religious exploits, all the things they've done. Well, I feed so many kids in this hunger program in Africa, and I've taught Sunday school class, and I was an usher at the church, and I read my Bible 17 times a day, and I pray 24 hours a day. And they go on and on about all the stuff that they do as if, one, I even care. I mean, I want people to be righteous, but I'm not doing a checklist. Well, hey, you made it. You're in heaven. You're good. I mean, I don't do that. The Bible doesn't talk about doing that. But what I've also found out is that after a while, their lives become unraveled. They spin out of control like a top, and they skip off. And they're not everything that they claim to be. Because arrogance makes us put out a false front. It doesn't reveal who we really are. You can be confident in who you are and in your abilities that God has given you, but don't be arrogant about it. David was confident, but he wasn't saying, hey, look at me, I'm a great giant killer, and God's been with me, and everything's awesome, and I'm going to teach all you guys how to be soldiers today. David didn't say that. And you would do well to remember this, that all the abilities that you have are because God has given them to you. While talking with Moses, while talking to God, Moses was reminded by God, who made your mouth? Who created you? God was letting Moses know, I know everything about you. I know that you stutter, but I will still use you. And he used him. See, sometimes we think that we can't be used, but God knows everything about us. And it would do well for you to remember, have confidence in all that God has given you. If you're a great ball player, it's because God has allowed you to do that. If you're a great sports person, God's given you the talent to do that. Clearly, He's not given me that talent. But if maybe you're a great musician, a great speaker, a great counselor, a great talker, it doesn't matter what you are. God has given you that talent. Humble yourself and thank God for it. Be confident knowing that God has given it to you. The story moves on in verses 38 and 40. It says, then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor and bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened his sword on his tunic and began to walk around. But then he quickly realized, I cannot go in these, he said, because I am not used to them. And so he takes them all off and he leaves them on the ground and he goes in the way that he knows. I mean, it's interesting when you read this story because David is a small boy. And Saul, it says, was head and shoulders above the rest. Just the physicalness of the armor, Saul's armor for someone this tall is not going to fit on a little guy this big. It just isn't going to work. There's a picture that I have when I was in 4th grade and we would dress up for school like during Halloween time. And so I put on some of my dad's army uniform one time and I looked like just a baggy boy. I mean, I know that's all hip now to have baggy clothes and stuff like that. But back then I was like trying to be all cool. But I mean, the hat came down past my ears and the shirt was like so big and everything. And I mean, it just didn't look right. And that's David. He's got this armor on of Saul's and it just doesn't fit. It's not made for him. It just doesn't look right. So here's what I want to say to you. The next lesson to our youth, and that is this. Be yourself. Be yourself. Saul wanted David to wear his armor because that's how he would have faced Goliath. But David didn't fit in that armor. He wasn't used to it. His movement was now limiting. And all the things that he had learned about how to defend himself would not work when he's got this bulky armor on. And so he takes it off and he goes the way he knows to defend himself with a simple sling and a tunic and God by his side. We live in a world where we are constantly told that we are not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not pretty enough, we're not thin enough, we're not tall enough, and the list can go on and on and on. And so if you want to be somebody, well then you need to copy all those who, quote, have it together. Well, let me just tell you that all those who seem to have it together, they really don't. Snoop Dogg ain't no Superman, you know what I'm saying? And J-Lo gets pimples from time to time, and Lady Gaga, well, I really don't have to say much about her. And Miley Cyrus, well, that's a train wreck. I mean, these people who think that they have it all together, that we're looking up to as young people, they don't really have it all together. We learned this so very well with the death recently of Robin Williams. I mean, this guy is at the top of the comedic world, and yet his tragic death lets us know that he was just as lost and as hurting as anybody else. And so is Miley Cyrus. Why do you act that way unless you're hurting on the inside? And Lady Gaga, why do you act that way unless you really have no confidence about who you are? I mean, no one can act that crazy. Help me out, Dr. Les, unless they got problems. They need to come see you. You know what I'm saying? We should tell them they can have a free session. We'll give them 2, you know? Be who God created you to be. He made you the way He wants you, with your looks, your body makeup, your intelligence, and all the rest. He loves you. He sees you as perfect in His eyes. Be yourself. And when you're yourself, God can use you just the way you are, to copy Bruno Mars' song. In verses 41 through 49, David heads to the battle. Goliath is there shouting, defying God of heaven and calling down all these things. He chastises David. What is this? You've sent this boy out. Am I a dog that I should deal with him? I'm going to kill you and it's all going to be over with. And David says, that's not what's going to happen. I'm going to take you down. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut off your head, and the birds are going to feast on you like it's Golden Corral. They are going to have some good time. And David wastes no time. He runs after him and he throws the stone at him, and it hits Goliath right in the head, and he had an Excedrin moment that never got fixed. He went down dead. David runs over and cuts off his head with his own sword. Now, here's the 5th lesson I want us to learn. This is to everyone, to youth and adults as well. Do not be afraid to take on God-sized challenges. Don't be afraid to take on God-sized challenges. We can too often see the size of the challenge and think that there's no way that we can accomplish this. And that is because most of us only take on the problems that we already know that we have the talents and the skills to complete. I am so very much that way. When I take on a project, it's usually because I know that if no one else is in the project, I know where my talent and skills lie, and I can still accomplish the goal of the project. But God is teaching me, and I'm learning, though I'm a slow learner, to say, I'm willing to go, and you provide the victory. I know my talents can only take us this far, but the goal is over here. And so between here and here, God, either you send someone or you carry the victory yourself. Learn to take on those God-sized challenges that only God in them will they succeed. Because we want to have these great miracles in our life, but God says, why do I need to send a great miracle? You've already got it all worked out. You figured out how everyone's going to do it. You don't need me involved in that. So we need challenges that we say, God, we need you involved in this. We feel you are calling us to this, and without you, we will not succeed. And so we're turning it over to you. And when God moves, that's when the church gets excited and erupts in joy, because we're like, God did something awesome that we could not do ourselves. Nothing is impossible with God. Don't be afraid to take on the God-sized challenges, the Goliaths, whatever they are in your life. If God is on your side, you can strike them down. Seeing this amazing upset in verses 50 and 53. Seeing this amazing upset, the army of Israel is stirred into action. They see this young boy strike down this 9-foot-tall giant. He takes his huge sword. He cuts off his head. He's holding it up. And the army of Israel rallies, and they think, if this guy can do that, then we can too. And they start after these Philistines. The Philistines are scared. They run off. Our team captain's just been killed, and they go running for the hills. And the army of Israel chases after them. They chase them all the way to Gath, which was the hometown of where Goliath was from, and to Ekron, one of the other 5 major Philistine cities. When they came back, they plundered the Philistine camp. And not only the Philistines, but the army of Israel learned this, that God's power was there. So here's my last lesson, and this is to the adults. Youthful energy and excitement is needed to reignite our passion sometimes. Youthful energy and excitement is needed to reignite our passions sometimes. The older we get, the more we begin to lose some of the great compassion and excitement that we once had when we were younger in serving God. Life, with all of its struggles and all of its stresses, just seems to rob us of the joy of serving God day after day. I listen to people talk about this in terms of marriage. Some of you have been married for a while, know what I'm talking about. This will resonate with you. Oftentimes, they talk fondly about the times when they had first gotten married and they had nothing. They had no money. They had no house to call their own. They didn't have a car that would consistently run. They might have had to share a car or take the bus or walk. They had 2 folding chairs as furniture in the living room because there was nothing else. They shared a hot dog and a can of beans, and they called it a gourmet meal. And they loved being together. They didn't have all the other things that can distract us in life, but they loved being together. They talked about their first Sunday school class they had, and maybe some of the early services that they went to in church, and how they got involved and how they sacrificed, and they just loved doing what they were doing. If they could only go back to those days and all the rest of the stuff get fallen away so we can get back to the basics. I know I feel like that sometimes. My life with Michelle in those early days of the church, where there was nothing to distract us, sometimes were the most joyous times of serving in the church. We just loved being with people. We loved being there and getting out of what was going on. We didn't have a whole lot to entertain us at home. And so we went and been there with people. It's so easy in the church to lose the excitement as we age through the church. We have to struggle with what I call the 3 C's. Number 1 is this: our comfortableness. The longer we're in church, the longer we're a Christian, we get so comfortable. We get used to how things are. We get to know everybody. We know how things operate. And we say, don't change anything. I finally know everybody. Some of you get frustrated because there are people that come to the church and you don't know who they are. Good, get used to it. Heaven's going to be like that. You're not going to know everybody there. You're going to learn to know everybody there. You're going to talk. And if you're comfortable in the church, then honestly, we're not doing things right. Because it should always be uncomfortable in the sense that there's new people, things are changing, new ways are happening, new ministries are being developed, and all those different things there. Because when we get out of our comfort zone, it keeps us on our toes. When we're comfortable, we move into this next phase, and that is complacency. We start to take for granted that church happens, that Bible studies happen, that the Word of God's being taught, that sermons are put together, that worship stuff. This stuff doesn't just happen up here. There's hours of rehearsal time that goes in here. The tech team has to learn how to run all those different things and make sure everything's just right. And it takes a lot of people involved to make all these 3 hours happen on Sunday morning. But we become complacent and we just walk in, we sit in the pew, we hear a great sermon, we laugh a little bit, take the Lord's Supper, put $2 in the offering plate because that's all the sermon was worth, and we go home and we call it a good Sunday. We become so complacent at times that we forget how much is involved in making church happen. And let me just tell you, church only happens when every hand is involved carrying the load. Every hand. When complacency sets in, this 3rd C happens, and that is a callousness comes over us. We harden our hearts to hurting people, to lost people, and to new people. We forget from where we once came from, that we were sinners, that there was a day when we walked in and we were brand new and no one knew us. When we had a hurt that was in our heart that we couldn't deal with. When we had sin that had not been forgiven. When we moved to the area and we didn't know where to start. We had no friends and no one to talk to. We forget all of that stuff. We become calloused. Calluses come after we've had a blister on our hand for a while, right? You go out and work for the first time and you're working there and you're not used to it and you get a blister and a blister stings, right? And it reminds you you did something and you can feel it every time you touch something. Grab a hand or a handle or something like that. Ow, that hurts a little bit. But after a while, layers of skin begin to build up and we get a hard callus there to the point that sometimes we can get some calluses. You could get a thorn in a callus and you wouldn't even know it was there. You wouldn't feel it anymore. When we first started ministry, we did ministry with people. It was like getting a blister. It stung once in a while. It hurt us sometimes to be involved. But then after a while, layers of skin build up and we become callous and we bump into someone who doesn't know Jesus and we don't feel it. We bump into someone who's hurt and we don't feel it. We bump into someone who is new and we don't recognize it. Why? Because we have calloused ourselves. Our hearts have become hardened and we've forgotten what's going on. Now, I say all that to say this. Seeing the excitement and youthfulness of young people helps us to pull those calluses off so we can start feeling again. So it can ignite the flame that is in us. The excitement that young people have with all of their craziness and all of their energy, I mean, it's just like putting some sparks onto a can of gasoline that's just waiting to be brought into flames. Mark, you know how you and I know that, man. Yeah. If you need to light up some gasoline, Mark is your man. I mean, he'll help you out. Only with me, you know. You may not be able, if you don't know it, Mark caught me on fire. That's why I say that. Hey, that's how I remember the story. I'm preaching here. You may not be into all of those things that they do. And we're going to have them up here on our fifth Sunday, leading worship and all that. You may not be into all those things, but you can't help but say they have energy and excitement and joy about serving God. And they may dance from one side of the stage to the other, and their hands are raised, and they just smile like, there's no tomorrow. But you can't help but say these kids love God. David's great challenge and his great victory steered the whole course. It changed the trajectory of the whole nation of Israel. Not only do they win this battle, but they start winning preceding battles. And David eventually becomes king. And yes, he has his moral failure, but he becomes a king that's after God's own heart. So much so that when the nation of Israel will refer back to the monarch period, they always want to go back to the time under King David. That was the highlight of everything. My point is this: that we have young people in our church today that can change the trajectory of our church, our community, and our nation. And we have to all work together to ensure that that direction is towards the righteousness and the godly things that God wants us to do, and not the wicked things that our world is trying to draw them into. See, I don't think it's about having a church of young people or a church of old people or anywhere in between. I think it's about having a church of people who love God. And they need us with our stability and our wisdom to share with them, and we need them with their energy and their excitement and their willingness to go when we cannot. We need each other. So let's not divide with one another or fight with one another, but let's join hands with each other and say, God has gifted us all to build His kingdom here on earth. Let me pray for you.